Jacob Mills was considered the territory's biggest failure until the morning he stepped into a hail of arrows to protect a cattle baroness's fortune, transforming his worthless reputation into something far more valuable than gold. As the poor widower collapsed behind the rocks with arrow wounds marking his sacrifice, everyone wondered the same thing. Could a man's scars truly be worth more than the wealth he'd never possessed? Blood froze in the water bucket outside Jacob Mills' cabin that October morning in 1867, and he knew winter would come early to the Nebraska territory. The ice cracked like gunshots when he broke through with his bare fist, sending sharp pain up his arm that mixed with the deeper ache of 3 years without his wife Mary. His stomach twisted with hunger as he splashed the freezing water on his face, but the cold helped him forget how empty his food stores had become. The wind howled across the endless prairie grass, bending it low like the heads of people in church when the preacher talked about sinners. Jacob pulled his father's old hat down tight and stepped outside to check his fence line. The wooden posts leaned at crazy angles after last week's storm, and he knew the banker would be coming soon to ask about money he didn't have. Everyone in town whispered that Jacob Mills was the unluckiest man in the territory, and most days he believed them. He hammered at a loose fence post with hands that shook from cold and worry. The sound echoed across the empty land like thunder, but no one lived close enough to hear it. His nearest neighbor was 5 miles east, and the Ashford Ranch stretched for thousands of acres to the south. Jacob had seen their cattle from a distance sometimes, fat and healthy while his own dreams died in the drought-cracked soil. A shadow passed overhead, and Jacob looked up to see a hawk circling high above. The bird's cry sounded lonely, just like the wind that never stopped blowing across this endless sea of grass. He envied that hawk sometimes, free to soar above all the troubles that kept men awake at night. But even hawks had to hunt for food, and Jacob understood that kind of desperation better than most. The fence post finally stood straight, though Jacob knew it wouldn't last long in this hard ground. Nothing lasted long out here except the wind and the grass and the memories that followed a man wherever he went. He wiped his hands on his worn pants and looked toward the distant hills where smoke sometimes rose from the Ashford Ranch house. Rich folks lived different lives, he figured, with problems he could never imagine and comforts he would never know. His stomach growled loud enough to startle a prairie dog, and Jacob remembered the rabbit he'd shot yesterday. It would make a thin stew, but it was better than nothing. He'd learned to be grateful for small things since Mary died, though gratitude felt harder some days than others. The preacher said God tested people to make them stronger, but Jacob wondered if maybe God had forgotten about him entirely. As he walked back to his cabin, Jacob noticed fresh horse tracks in the mud near his well. Someone had been here recently, probably while he was checking his trap line yesterday morning. The tracks were small and neat, made by a horse that ate better grain than most people around here ate bread. He followed the tracks with his eyes until they disappeared over a low hill heading south toward the big ranches. The cabin felt even smaller when he stepped inside, with its single room and furniture made from whatever wood he could find. Mary's rocking chair still sat by the window, though he hadn't moved it since the day she died. Sometimes he caught himself listening for the creak of those rockers, the way she used to hum while she mended his shirts. But the only sounds now were wind through the walls and mice scratching in the space between the logs. Jacob stirred the coals in his fireplace and added the last piece of wood from his pile. Tomorrow he would have to search for more fuel, though trees were scarce on the open prairie. Everything took more work out here, and a man alone faced twice the troubles of those with families to help. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, along with many others that no one teaches you until life forces them on you. The rabbit stew smelled good as it cooked, even with just wild onions and salt to flavor it. Jacob's mouth watered as he stirred the pot, remembering meals Mary used to make with real vegetables from their garden. But that garden had died with her, along with most of his hope for making this land work. Some men were meant to be farmers, he supposed, and others were just meant to struggle. Thunder rumbled in the distance, though no clouds darkened the sky. Jacob stepped outside and listened carefully, trying to understand what his ears were telling him. The sound came again, but it wasn't thunder at all. It was something else entirely, something that made his heart beat faster with a mixture of curiosity and concern that would change everything. The sound of hoofbeats came like rolling thunder across the morning prairie, and Jacob squinted into the pale sunlight to see a horse and rider charging straight toward his land. The animal moved like liquid fire, its coat shining red-brown in the early light, but something was wrong with the way it ran. The horse stumbled and lurched, and Jacob could see the rider fighting to stay in the saddle as they raced toward his broken fence line. "Whoa there!" Jacob shouted, dropping his coffee cup and running toward the approaching danger. The rider was a woman, he realized with shock, wearing clothes that cost more than most folks made in a year. Her green dress sparkled with gold thread, and her hat had real feathers that fluttered like bird wings in the wind. This was no ordinary traveler. This was someone important, someone with money and power, someone who had no business being anywhere near his poor excuse for a homestead. The horse hit a prairie dog hole at full speed, and Jacob watched in horror as both animal and rider went down hard. The woman flew through the air like a rag doll, hitting the ground with a sound that made Jacob's stomach turn. She rolled twice and lay still, her fancy dress now torn and dirty, blood already showing bright red against her pale skin. Jacob reached her side just as she tried to sit up, her face twisted with pain and confusion. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 25 or so, with eyes the color of winter sage and hair that caught the sunlight like spun gold. But it was the way she looked at him that struck Jacob most. Not with fear or anger, but with surprise, as if she hadn't expected to find kindness in such a rough place. "Don't move," Jacob said gently, kneeling beside her in the grass. "You took a hard fall, and something might be broken." He'd seen enough accidents on the frontier to know the signs of serious injury, and this woman needed help fast. Her left arm bent at an angle that made him wince, and blood trickled from a cut above her eye that would need careful cleaning. "I can't. I shouldn't be here," she whispered, trying again to stand despite Jacob's gentle pressure to keep her still. "My brother will be looking for me, and if he finds me with—" She gestured weakly at Jacob's poor clothes and humble surroundings, and he understood immediately. Rich folks didn't associate with failures like him, especially not young women whose reputations mattered more than their lives. "Lady, right now you need doctoring more than you need worrying about what people think," Jacob said firmly. "Your arm's broken, and you might have hurt your head when you fell. I can help you, but first you need to let me." He studied her face, seeing the war between pride and pain that played out in her expression. She was used to giving orders, not taking help from strangers. The woman's horse had gotten back to its feet and stood nearby, favoring its right front leg but not seriously hurt. Jacob recognized the animal now, a thoroughbred mare worth more than his entire homestead, the kind of horse that only the wealthiest ranchers could afford to own. Which meant this woman was likely Victoria Ashford, the cattle baroness whose family controlled more land than some entire counties back east. "Miss Ashford?" Jacob asked quietly, and saw her eyes widen with surprise that he knew her name. "I'm Jacob Mills. I live here, such as it is." He gestured toward his small cabin with its crooked chimney and patched roof. "I know we've never met proper, but right now that doesn't matter. What matters is getting you fixed up before that arm gets worse." Victoria Ashford stared at him for a long moment, and Jacob could almost see her thoughts racing behind those sage-colored eyes. She was calculating risks and weighing options, trying to decide if accepting help from a poor homesteader would cost her more than refusing it. But pain has a way of making decisions simple, and when another wave of hurt washed over her face, she nodded slowly. "I suppose I don't have much choice," she said, allowing Jacob to help her carefully to her feet. "But this stays between us, Mr. Mills. My family has expectations about such things." Her voice carried the weight of a lifetime spent living up to other people's ideas about proper behavior, and Jacob heard echoes of his own struggles with community judgment. As they walked slowly toward his cabin, Victoria leaning heavily on his arm, Jacob wondered what strange twist of fate had brought the territory's richest woman to his doorstep. He'd always believed that luck was something that happened to other people, but maybe today would prove him wrong. Or maybe, he thought as he helped her up his front steps, this was just another kind of trouble wearing a prettier face. The morning sun climbed higher as Jacob settled Victoria into his only comfortable chair and began tearing strips from his cleanest shirt to make bandages. Neither of them could have guessed that this accident would become the first chapter in a story that would shake the foundations of everything they thought they knew about worth, courage, and the strange ways that destiny sometimes disguises itself as disaster. "This is going to hurt something fierce," Jacob warned as he examined Victoria's twisted wrist. But his voice carried the steady calm of a man who doctored injured animals and knew broken bones by sight. The morning light streaming through his small window showed the damage clearly. Her arm bent wrong just above the wrist, already swelling purple beneath skin pale as fresh cream. He'd set bones before, mostly for horses and cattle, but never for someone whose injury could change his entire future. Victoria bit her lower lip and nodded, watching Jacob's weathered hands move with surprising gentleness as he prepared makeshift splints from kindling wood. "You've done this before," she observed, studying his face for signs of doubt or hesitation. Most men she knew would have panicked at the sight of so much responsibility, but Jacob worked with the focused attention of someone accustomed to solving problems with limited resources. "Animals mostly," Jacob admitted, positioning the wooden strips along her forearm. "But bones are bones, whether they belong to horses or people." He met her eyes directly, and Victoria saw something there that wealth couldn't buy. Genuine competence born from necessity rather than education. "The trick is getting everything lined up straight before the swelling gets worse." The setting process took longer than either expected, with Jacob stopping frequently to let Victoria rest when pain made her face go white. She gripped his kitchen table with her good hand, surprised by her own strength when the hurt peaked and crashed over her like ocean waves. Through it all, Jacob maintained a steady stream of quiet conversation, telling stories about his late wife's garden and the prairie storms that could flatten a man's hopes in minutes. "Mary used to say that pain was just God's way of reminding us we're still alive," Jacob said as he wrapped Victoria's splinted arm with strips torn from his best shirt. "Course, she also said suffering builds character, which always struck me as something folks with comfortable lives tell folks without them." His smile held no bitterness, just the dry humor of someone who'd learned to find jokes in dark places. Victoria found herself laughing despite the throbbing in her arm, surprised by Jacob's ability to ease tension with simple honesty. In her world of elaborate social dancing and careful word choices, his direct manner felt like cool water after years of drinking warm tea. "Your wife sounds like she was wise," Victoria said, then immediately wondered why she'd used past tense without thinking. "She was many things," Jacob replied, his voice carrying memories like smoke carries the scent of distant fires. "Wise, stubborn, kind to a fault, and convinced she could make this land bloom if she just worked hard enough." The consumption took her before she could finish proving herself right. He tied the final knot in Victoria's bandage, his movements gentle but sure. The mention of death hung between them like morning mist, and Victoria realized she knew nothing about the private sorrows of people she'd considered beneath her notice. Jacob's loss felt suddenly real in a way that formal condolences at church never had, and she understood that her accident had dropped her into the middle of someone else's complicated story. "I'm sorry," she said simply, the words carrying more weight than elaborate sympathy ever could. "Losing someone you love. I can't imagine how you bear it." Her own life had been cushioned from such raw grief by money and social position, but sitting in Jacob's humble kitchen with her arm throbbing, she glimpsed the kind of pain that shapes a person's entire world. Jacob busied himself making coffee from grounds he'd probably used twice already, giving them both time to step back from the edge of too much honesty too soon. "We bear what we have to," he said finally, "and sometimes strangers show up hurt on our doorstep, reminding us that helping others helps us heal too." He poured steaming coffee into 2 mismatched cups, the rich smell filling his small cabin with unexpected warmth. Victoria accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her good hand around the warm cup and inhaling the bitter comfort. She'd never tasted coffee this strong. Her family's cook always served delicate blends that whispered rather than shouted, but Jacob's harsh brew matched the honest directness of everything else about him. "This is quite strong," she said, not complaining but observing. "Strong coffee, like strong people, gets you through hard mornings," Jacob replied, settling into the chair across from her. though I suspect your usual mornings don't involve broken bones and strange kitchens. His eyes held curiosity about her world, but also wariness, as if he understood that their temporary connection would end as soon as her family discovered her whereabouts. Outside, Victoria's mare whinnied softly, reminding them both that the wider world still existed beyond Jacob's small refuge. Soon, search parties would fan out across the territory looking for the missing Ashford daughter, and when they found her here, questions would arise that neither of them was prepared to answer. But for now, in the growing warmth of Jacob's kitchen, Victoria felt safer than she had in years. "My brother will be searching by now," she said, reality creeping back into their shared moment of peace. Marcus doesn't handle uncertainty well, especially when it involves family reputation. The words carried the weight of a lifetime spent managing other people's expectations, and Jacob heard the exhaustion behind her careful phrasing. "Then we'd better figure out what story we're going to tell," Jacob said practically, "because something tells me the truth might be more complicated than either of us can handle right now." His words proved more prophetic than either could have imagined, as the sound of approaching horses began to rumble across the prairie like distant thunder, carrying with it the promise of confrontations that would test everything they thought they knew about courage, loyalty, and the price of standing up for what's right. Dust clouds rose like smoke signals against the morning sky as 3 riders crested the hill behind Jacob's cabin, their horses moving with the purposeful urgency of men on serious business. Victoria recognized the lead rider immediately. Buck Harrison, her family's foreman for 20 years, a man whose loyalty ran deeper than blood, but whose judgment sometimes ran thinner than water. The 2 men flanking him wore the hard expressions of hired guns, the kind who settled disputes with bullets rather than words. "Miss Victoria." Buck's voice cracked like a whip across the prairie air as he spotted her through Jacob's window. "Thank the Lord you're alive. Your brother's been half out of his mind with worry, and half the territory's been searching since your horse came back without you." His relief was genuine, but Victoria could see the questions forming behind his weathered face as he took in her surroundings. Jacob stepped outside first, his movements calm and deliberate, despite the obvious tension crackling between the 3 newcomers like electricity before a storm. He'd faced angry men before, creditors mostly, and neighbors who thought his failures reflected poorly on the whole territory. But these men carried a different kind of threat. Their hands rested casually near their weapons, and their eyes measured him like wolves sizing up prey. "Your lady took a hard fall from her horse," Jacob explained simply, his voice steady despite the danger he could feel radiating from Buck's companions. "Broke her arm pretty good, so I set it and gave her shelter until help arrived." He gestured toward Victoria's splinted limb, the crude bandaging clear evidence of his crude but effective medical work. Buck dismounted and approached the cabin with the careful steps of a man walking through a minefield. Victoria could see him calculating social mathematics, how to extract his employer's daughter from this compromising situation without creating scandal that could damage the Ashford name. "That's mighty neighborly of you, mister," Buck said, his tone polite but strained. "But Miss Victoria needs proper doctoring now, the kind only town can provide." "I understand your concern," Victoria interjected from the cabin doorway, her voice carrying the authority she'd been raised to wield. "But Mr. Mills has provided excellent care under difficult circumstances. I won't forget such kindness." Her words were carefully chosen, meant to protect Jacob from any backlash while acknowledging the debt she now owed him. One of Buck's companions, a lean man with scars across his knuckles, spat tobacco juice into the dirt and studied Jacob with undisguised contempt. "Mighty convenient, ain't it?" he drawled. "The territory's poorest dirt farmer just happens to be nearby when the richest lady has an accident. Makes a man wonder about coincidences." The implication hit Jacob like a physical blow, and Victoria saw his jaw tighten with the effort of controlling his temper. She'd witnessed this kind of casual cruelty before, the way wealth protected some people while leaving others vulnerable to suspicion and scorn. "Careful with your words, Crenshaw," she said sharply. "Mr. Mills is a gentleman, which is more than I can say for men who see evil where kindness exists." Buck shot his companion a warning look, but the damage was already done. The poison of suspicion had been introduced into what should have been a simple rescue, and Victoria realized that Jacob would face consequences for helping her that no good deed should earn. Her family's reputation would survive this incident, but his might not, especially if stories began circulating about improper behavior between classes. Perhaps we should discuss this more privately, Buck suggested, his diplomatic instincts finally engaging. Miss Victoria, if you could step outside so the men can talk. He gestured toward Jacob with the kind of dismissive authority that came from decades of managing ranch hands and settling disputes between stubborn people. But Victoria surprised everyone by shaking her head firmly. Whatever needs saying can be said in front of everyone, she declared. Mr. Mills saved my life and treated me with perfect respect. Any suggestion otherwise is an insult to us both. Her words carried the steel backbone that had made the Ashford family powerful, but also the personal conviction that came from witnessing true character up close. Jacob found himself caught between admiration for Victoria's courage and worry about the trouble she was creating for herself. Rich folks lived by different rules, but those rules were still rules, and breaking them carried costs that even money couldn't always fix. Miss Ashford speaks truly, he said quietly. Nothing happened here that any decent person wouldn't have done for an injured stranger. The standoff stretched like a taut rope between opposing forces, with Buck trying to balance loyalty to his employers against the growing evidence that Jacob Mills was exactly what he appeared to be. A poor but honorable man who'd helped someone in need. The hired guns remained suspicious, their worldview too narrow to accommodate acts of simple kindness, while Victoria stood firm in her defense of a man she'd known for less than half a day. Well then, Buck said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of decisions he didn't want to make. I suppose we'd better get you back to the ranch so the doc can look at that arm proper. Your brother's been wearing a path in the floor with his worrying. He avoided meeting Jacob's eyes, unsure how to acknowledge help he couldn't officially approve of. As Victoria prepared to leave Jacob's cabin, she turned back with an expression that promised the story was far from over. You have my gratitude, Mr. Mills, she said formally, and my family will remember this kindness. Her words carried implications that made Buck shift uncomfortably, because everyone knew that Ashford debts, once acknowledged, were always paid in full. The morning sun climbed higher as the rescue party prepared to depart, but the shadows they cast seemed longer and darker than before. Jacob watched them go with the uneasy feeling that his quiet life was about to become much more complicated, while Victoria rode away knowing that some encounters change everything, even when they begin with accidents and end with awkward goodbyes that solve nothing and promise everything. The thunder of hoofbeats at dawn announced trouble before Jacob even opened his eyes, and when he peered through his window, his heart sank at the sight of 12 armed riders surrounding his cabin like wolves circling wounded prey. At their head sat Marcus Ashford himself, Victoria's older brother, whose face carried the kind of cold fury that rich men wore when poor men dared to inconvenience them. The morning mist swirled around the horses' legs like ghostly fingers, and Jacob knew this confrontation would determine whether he remained a free man or became an example for others who forgot their place. Mills! Marcus's voice cut through the prairie silence like a blade through silk. Come out here and explain yourself. My sister spent the night under your roof, and half the territory is talking about it. He sat his horse with the arrogance of someone who'd never doubted his right to demand answers from lesser men. His expensive clothes and polished boots marking him as clearly as a brand marks cattle. Jacob pulled on his boots and stepped outside, moving slowly to show he carried no weapons and posed no threat. But 12 armed men suggested this wasn't about threats. It was about power and the social order that kept rich folks rich and poor folks in their place. Your sister was hurt, Mr. Ashford, Jacob said quietly. I helped her because it was the right thing to do. The right thing. Marcus laughed, but the sound held no humor, only the bitter edge of a man whose family reputation mattered more than human decency. The right thing would have been sending her straight home instead of keeping her here overnight like some common. He stopped himself, but the unfinished insult hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Victoria emerged from the cabin at that moment, her splinted arm cradled against her chest but her spine straight with determination. She'd heard every word, and her eyes blazed with anger that made her brother's fury look like a candle beside a bonfire. "Like some common what, Marcus?" she demanded. "Finish your thought, because I'm curious to hear how you'd describe the man who saved my life." The tension stretched tight as a bowstring between the siblings, and Jacob found himself caught in the middle of a family argument that had roots deeper than his simple act of kindness. He could see years of conflict between them, Victoria's independent spirit clashing against Marcus's need to control everything within his reach. Money hadn't bought them happiness, just more expensive ways to hurt each other. "Victoria, you're coming home now," Marcus declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to instant obedience. "Dr. Whitman is waiting to examine your arm properly, and we need to discuss how to handle the gossip this situation has created." His eyes never left Jacob's face, measuring him like a rancher evaluating livestock before deciding which animals to cull. But Victoria stepped closer to Jacob instead of toward her brother's horse, and Jacob felt the dangerous shift in the morning's balance. "I'll come home when I'm ready," she said firmly. "Mr. Mills has shown me more courtesy in one night than I've received from supposedly civilized society in years. Perhaps the problem isn't where I spent the night, but why my own family assumes the worst about a man who asked for nothing in return for his help." One of Marcus's riders, a hard-faced man with the look of someone who settled disputes with violence, shifted restlessly in his saddle. "Boss, we could just take her," he suggested, his hand resting meaningfully on his gun, "but wouldn't be the first time we've had to drag someone home for their own good." The casual threat sent ice through Jacob's veins, because he recognized the type, men who solved problems with bullets and asked questions later. Jacob stepped forward despite the odds, placing himself between Victoria and the mounted men. "The lady can make her own choices," he said, his voice steady even though his mouth felt dry as dust. "And any man who thinks otherwise might want to reconsider." It was probably the most foolish thing he'd ever said, but some moments demanded courage regardless of consequences. Marcus studied Jacob with new interest, surprised by the poor man's willingness to face down superior numbers for the sake of principle. "You've got spine. I'll give you that," he admitted grudgingly. "But spine doesn't change facts, and the fact is that my sister's reputation can't survive this kind of scandal. People are already talking, and talk has a way of growing into something uglier." "Let them talk," Victoria said defiantly. "I've spent my entire life worried about what other people think, and where has it gotten me? Lonely dinners with boring men who want my money more than my company, and conversations so dull they could put a thunderstorm to sleep. Mr. Mills treated me like a person, not a prize to be won or a problem to be managed." The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the mist and revealing the full scope of the confrontation. Jacob's few neighbors had emerged from their distant cabins to watch the drama unfold, drawn by the unusual sight of so many horses in one place. Word would spread fast about whatever happened here, and Jacob knew his future in the territory hung in the balance of the next few minutes. "This is bigger than personal feelings, Victoria," Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of genuine concern beneath the anger. "The Ashford name means something in this territory. It opens doors, creates opportunities, and protects people who depend on us for their livelihoods. One scandal can undo generations of careful work." His words revealed the weight he carried as the family's leader, the burden of responsibility that came with wealth and power. But Victoria shook her head, her decision crystallizing with the clarity that comes from seeing truth after years of confusion. "No, Marcus. What protects people is character, not reputation. Mr. Mills has more honor in his little finger than most men have in their entire bodies, and I won't stand by while good people suffer for helping others." Her words rang across the prairie like church bells, clear and true and impossible to ignore. Jacob felt something shift inside him as he listened to Victoria defend him against her own family. For 3 years he'd accepted the territory's judgment that he was a failure, a man whose dreams had died with his wife and whose future held nothing but struggle and disappointment. But hearing Victoria speak about honor and character made him remember who he'd been before grief and poverty wore him down to nothing. The standoff continued as the sun rose higher, 12 armed men facing one poor farmer and one determined woman, while an entire community watched to see how the story would end. Jacob could feel destiny gathering around them like storm clouds, and he knew that whatever happened next would change everything for everyone involved in ways none of them could imagine. War whoops shattered the morning silence like glass breaking against stone, and every head turned toward the eastern hills where a line of mounted warriors had appeared as if conjured from the prairie grass itself. 20 Lakota riders sat their horses along the ridge, their war paint bright as blood in the climbing sun, while their ponies danced with the restless energy of predators scenting prey. The long simmering tensions over broken treaties and stolen lands had finally boiled over into open conflict, and the timing couldn't have been worse for everyone gathered around Jacob's cabin. "Sweet Jesus," Buck whispered, his weathered hand moving instinctively toward his rifle. "That's Two Bears' war party. They've been raiding ranches north of here for weeks, taking cattle and horses to feed their families through winter." The old foreman's voice carried the grim knowledge of a man who'd lived through too many such confrontations, each one ending in blood and sorrow for both sides. Marcus Ashford's fury at his sister's defiance evaporated like morning dew as he processed this new and deadly threat. The family argument that had seemed so important moments ago now felt petty compared to the immediate danger facing them all. "How many cattle are in the valley?" he demanded, his mind already calculating losses and strategic responses. "Near 300 head scattered across the bottomland," Buck replied, studying the war party through narrowed eyes. "They're positioned perfect to cut off any retreat toward the ranch house. Smart tactics. They've got us pinned against the creek with nowhere to run." His assessment carried the weight of military experience gained during years of frontier conflict. Jacob studied the terrain with the eye of a hunter who'd learned to read the land for survival rather than profit. The warriors held the high ground, commanding clear views of the entire valley, while the cattle grazed in open pasture that offered no cover for defenders. But there was something else, a cluster of rocks about 200 yards southeast that could provide a defensive position if someone could reach it alive. Victoria watched the war party with a mixture of fear and fascination, seeing her first glimpse of the indigenous people whose lands her family had claimed through legal papers that meant nothing to those who'd lived here for generations. The warriors looked magnificent and terrible in their war paint, proud men driven to desperate measures by hunger and the endless encroachment of settlers who saw only empty land where entire cultures had flourished. "They want the cattle," Jacob said quietly, his voice cutting through the tense speculation around him. "And they've got every right to be angry about what's been taken from them. But those animals represent more than just meat. They're the livelihood for every family that works this ranch, every merchant who depends on cattle money, every child who eats because their father draws wages from the Ashford payroll." Two Bears himself, recognizable by the twin bear claws hanging from his neck, raised his rifle above his head in a gesture that needed no translation. The war party began moving down the slope with disciplined precision, their ponies picking careful paths through the rocks, while their riders kept weapons ready for instant use. This wasn't a wild charge, but a calculated military operation designed to maximize success while minimizing risk. "They'll try to stampede the herd first," Buck observed, checking his weapons with practiced efficiency. "Scatter the cattle so we can't gather them quick, then pick off anyone who tries to stop them. It's what I'd do in their place." His grudging respect for enemy tactics spoke to the complex relationship between settlers and natives, built on mutual understanding that rarely led to mutual peace. Marcus found himself facing a choice that would define his leadership: protect his family's wealth or protect his family's lives. The cattle represented years of investment and careful breeding, but the people around him represented irreplaceable human connections. "We need to get everyone to safety," he decided. "The animals aren't worth dying for." But Jacob was studying those distant rocks again, his mind working through possibilities that others couldn't see. "Maybe they don't have to be lost," he said slowly. "If someone could reach that stone outcrop, they'd have clear shots at anyone trying to drive the herd. Might be enough to make them reconsider the cost of taking those cattle." "That's a suicide run," Marcus objected, following Jacob's gaze to the rocks that lay across 200 yards of open ground. "No man could cross that distance alive with 20 rifles trained on him. It's pure madness to even consider such a thing." Victoria looked between the two men, seeing something in Jacob's expression that Marcus missed. The quiet determination of someone who'd already decided to risk everything for others. She'd witnessed his character during their brief time together, seen how he measured worth by service rather than success, and she understood with growing dread that he was planning something heroic and probably fatal. "Jacob, no," she said softly, reading his intentions in the set of his shoulders and the way he checked his rifle's action. "You don't owe us anything. You've already done more than enough by helping me. Don't throw your life away for cattle that belong to people who've never shown you kindness." But Jacob was remembering all the families who would suffer if the Ashford Ranch failed. The cowboys and their wives, the children who depended on steady wages, the merchants and suppliers whose own livelihoods were tied to the cattle business. He thought of Mary and how she'd always believed that good people had obligations to help others, even when helping came at personal cost. "Sometimes a man has to stand up," Jacob said simply, his voice carrying the quiet conviction of someone who'd found his purpose in the most unlikely moment. Not for the cattle and not even for the money they represent, but for the idea that decent folks shouldn't have to suffer because others choose violence over talk. The war party was halfway down the slope now, close enough that individual faces could be seen beneath the war paint. Time was running out for any decision, and Jacob knew that hesitation would cost everyone more than action ever could. He checked his rifle one final time, whispered a prayer to Mary's memory, and prepared to discover whether courage was something he possessed or just something he'd imagined during the long, lonely nights since her death. The morning sun climbed higher as 20 warriors and one poor farmer prepared for a confrontation that would echo through territorial history, while 300 cattle grazed peacefully in the valley below, unaware that their fate hung in the balance between desperation and determination, between the weight of the past and the price of the future. The first arrow whistled past Jacob's ear like an angry hornet as he sprinted across the open prairie, his legs pumping with desperate strength while 20 rifles tracked his zigzagging path toward the distant rocks. Death flew around him in wooden shafts tipped with iron points, each one missing by inches that felt like miles as he dove and rolled through the sagebrush with his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird fighting for freedom. Behind him, Victoria's scream cut through the morning air. But Jacob couldn't look back. Not when every second of hesitation meant another chance for two Bears warriors to find their mark. The rocky outcrop seemed to grow farther away with each step, a mirage of safety that danced just beyond his reach, while arrows thudded into the ground around his boots. Jacob's lungs burned like forge bellows, and sweat stung his eyes despite the cool October air. But he kept running because stopping meant dying and dying meant failing everyone who depended on those cattle for their survival. 50 yards out, an arrow caught his shoulder, spinning him sideways but not dropping him as pain exploded down his arm like liquid fire. Two Bears himself drew back his bowstring, tracking Jacob's erratic movement with the patience of a hunter who'd brought down buffalo on the run. The war chief's face remained calm beneath its paint, showing the focused concentration of a man who understood that this single shot could determine the outcome of the entire raid. His arrow flew true, but Jacob stumbled at the perfect moment, and the shaft that should have pierced his heart instead tore through the meat of his left thigh. Victoria watched in horror as blood soaked through Jacob's pants, marking his trail across the prairie like breadcrumbs in a dark fairy tale. She'd never seen such raw courage before. Not the calculated bravery of soldiers following orders, but the pure determination of someone risking everything for strangers who'd shown him nothing but scorn. "He's going to make it," she whispered, though her voice carried more prayer than conviction. 20 yards from the rocks, a third arrow found its mark, piercing Jacob's side just below the ribs with a wet sound that made Marcus wince despite himself. The poor farmer stumbled again, his stride faltering as blood began to flow freely, but somehow he stayed upright and kept moving toward salvation that seemed both impossibly close and infinitely distant. His rifle remained clutched in his right hand, ready for the fight that would determine everything. Buck Harrison shook his head in amazement as Jacob dove behind the stone barrier with arrows still flying around him like deadly rain. "I've seen cavalry charges with less grit than that," the old foreman muttered. "That man just crossed 200 yards of open ground with half the Lakota Nation trying to kill him, and he's still fighting ready." The admiration in his voice surprised even him, because Buck had spent 40 years on the frontier and thought he'd seen every kind of courage possible. From his position among the rocks, Jacob began returning fire with methodical precision that spoke to years of hunting for survival rather than sport. Each shot was carefully aimed and conservatively rationed, because he carried only 30 rounds and needed to make every bullet count against enemies who outnumbered him 20-1. His first shot dropped a warrior's horse, sending its rider tumbling into a cluster of prickly pear cactus that would keep him busy for several minutes. 2 bears called out commands in Lakota, his voice carrying across the valley as he repositioned his warriors to deal with this unexpected resistance from an impossible angle. The war chief had planned for many contingencies, but a single defender reaching those rocks hadn't been among them. Now his entire tactical advantage was threatened by one man's willingness to sacrifice himself for others, a concept that 2 bears understood and respected, even as he worked to counter it. The cattle had begun to mill nervously as gunfire echoed across the valley, their bovine instincts sensing danger without understanding its source. 300 head of prime beef represented wealth beyond most people's imagination, but more importantly, they represented security for dozens of families whose children would go hungry if the herd was lost. Jacob's third shot shattered a warrior's rifle, sending splinters of wood and metal flying, while its owner dove for cover behind a fallen log. Marcus found himself reassessing everything he'd believed about worth and character as he watched a man he'd dismissed as worthless hold off an entire war party through sheer determination. The social mathematics that had seemed so important an hour ago, reputation, proper behavior, maintaining appropriate distances between classes, now felt petty compared to the raw courage being displayed by someone who owed the Ashford family nothing but contempt. Victoria couldn't tear her eyes away from the rocks where Jacob fought alone against impossible odds, 3 arrows protruding from his body like grim decorations on a scarecrow built for war. Blood stained his clothes and his movements had grown slower, but his rifle still spoke with deadly accuracy every few seconds, each shot carefully placed to maximize damage while conserving ammunition. She'd never imagined that heroism could look so desperate and so magnificent at the same time. 2 bears made a tactical decision that surprised his own warriors. He signaled for a withdrawal rather than pressing the attack against such determined resistance. The war chief had lost 2 horses and had 3 men wounded without getting close to the cattle, and experience had taught him that some victories cost more than defeats. The lone defender in the rocks had turned a simple raid into a costly battle, and 2 bears respected courage too much to waste more lives against it. As the war party began pulling back toward the hills, Jacob slumped against the rocks with relief flooding through him like cool water. He'd done the impossible, held off 20 warriors long enough to save the herd, but the cost was written in blood across his shirt and the growing weakness in his limbs. His ammunition was nearly exhausted, his strength was fading fast, and the arrows in his body throbbed with each heartbeat like drums beating a rhythm he didn't want to hear. The morning sun climbed higher as an unlikely hero discovered that sometimes the greatest victories come disguised as the most desperate gambles, while everyone who witnessed his stand learned that true worth isn't measured by what a man owns but by what he's willing to risk for others. The cattle grazed peacefully again, unaware that their fate had been decided by 3 arrows and 30 bullets fired by someone the world had written off as a failure. Blood painted the rocks around Jacob like abstract art drawn in crimson and pain as Victoria reached his position, her broken arm forgotten in her desperate need to help the man who just sacrificed everything for her family's cattle. 3 arrows jutted from his body at angles that made her stomach lurch, one through his shoulder, another piercing his thigh, and the third buried deep in his side where every breath sent fresh waves of agony across his weathered face. Yet somehow he remained conscious, his eyes still alert despite the growing pallor that spoke of serious blood loss. "Don't try to pull them out," Jacob gasped as Victoria knelt beside him, her hands hovering uncertainly over the wooden shafts that had transformed him into a human pincushion. "Arrowheads are barbed. They'll tear me apart coming out the same way they went in." His voice carried the strained quality of someone speaking through gritted teeth, but also the practical knowledge of a frontierman who understood wounds and their treatment. Marcus arrived at the rocks with Buck and 2 ranch hands, their faces reflecting a mixture of amazement and shame as they surveyed the scene. The man they dismissed as worthless lay bleeding among the stones like a broken doll, Yet he'd accomplished what a dozen armed cowboys might not have managed. The cattle still grazed safely in the valley below, worth thousands of dollars that would feed dozens of families through the coming winter. "We need to get him to Doc Whitman fast," Buck declared, his experienced eye assessing Jacob's condition with growing concern. "He's losing blood steady, and those arrows need proper removing before infection sets in." The old foreman had seen enough battlefield wounds to recognize the signs of serious trauma, and Jacob's gray complexion suggested they had little time to waste on transportation. Victoria tore strips from her petticoat with her good hand, creating makeshift bandages to slow the bleeding around each arrow shaft. Her touch was gentle but sure, surprising herself with knowledge she didn't know she possessed about wound care and trauma treatment. "You saved them all," she whispered to Jacob. "Every cow, every job, every family that depends on this ranch. Why would you do such a thing for people who've shown you nothing but coldness?" Jacob's smile came weak but genuine as he looked up at the woman whose accident had started this entire chain of events. "Because it needed doing," he said simply. "And because sometimes a man finds out what he's really worth when everything else gets stripped away." His words carried the quiet wisdom of someone who discovered his true character in the crucible of desperate action. Marcus knelt beside his sister, studying Jacob's face with new understanding dawning in his eyes. The social prejudices that had shaped his entire worldview seemed suddenly petty and arbitrary when confronted with such genuine heroism. "We misjudged you," he admitted, his voice carrying the weight of genuine remorse. "I misjudged you badly, and I'm sorry for that." "No need for apologies," Jacob replied, though speaking was becoming more difficult as shock began setting in from blood loss and trauma. "You were protecting your family and your reputation. Can't fault a man for that even when he goes about it wrong." His generosity of spirit amazed everyone present, because wounded men rarely showed such grace toward those who'd wronged them. Buck had been rigging a travois from broken fence posts and horse blankets, creating a makeshift stretcher that could transport Jacob without jostling the arrows embedded in his body. "This ain't going to be comfortable," he warned, "but it's the best we can manage out here. Doc's got proper tools for arrow removal, and laudanum for the pain that's coming." His matter-of-fact tone couldn't hide his respect for Jacob's stoic acceptance of suffering. As they carefully lifted Jacob onto the improvised stretcher, Victoria found herself holding his hand without conscious thought, offering what comfort she could to someone who'd asked for nothing and given everything. The morning sun caught the gold threads in her torn dress, making her look like some frontier angel watching over a fallen hero whose sacrifice had rewritten the social rules that governed their world. The journey back to Jacob's cabin took on the quality of a funeral procession, with the entire rescue party moving slowly to avoid jarring their wounded passenger. Victoria walked beside the travois despite her own injury, her eyes never leaving Jacob's face as she watched for signs of distress or failing consciousness. The man who'd been dismissed as the territory's greatest failure was now its most celebrated hero, though the irony seemed lost on everyone except Jacob himself. Two bears watched their progress from a distant hilltop, his weathered face reflecting something approaching respect for the lone defender who'd thwarted his raid through sheer determination. The war chief understood courage when he saw it, regardless of which side displayed it, and he would carry tales of this morning's battle back to his people as an example of how one man's character could change the outcome of any conflict. At the cabin, they transferred Jacob to his own bed while Buck rode hard toward town to fetch Doc Whitman and proper medical supplies. Victoria remained at Jacob's side, using her good hand to adjust his blankets and monitor his breathing as afternoon shadows began lengthening across the prairie. The arrows still protruded from his body like grim reminders of the price he'd paid for his heroism. "The cattle are safe," Victoria reported quietly, though she wasn't sure if Jacob was still conscious enough to hear her. "All 300 head, still grazing peacefully in the valley. Your sacrifice saved everything, the animals, the jobs, the families who depend on ranch work for their survival. You've become a legend in a single morning, Jacob Mills." Jacob's eyes fluttered open at the sound of his name, and he managed a weak smile that transformed his pain-creased features. "Not a legend," he whispered. "Just a man who finally figured out that being worth something has nothing to do with what you own, and everything to do with what you're willing to give away. His words carried the profound simplicity of truth discovered through suffering. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, painting the Nebraska territory in shades of gold and amber, everyone present understood that they'd witnessed something rare and precious. The moment when a human being discovered their true worth not through accumulation or achievement, but through sacrifice freely given for others' benefit. The arrows in Jacob's body would heal, but the example of his courage would echo through generations of stories told around frontier fires when people needed reminding about what real heroism looked like. Whiskey burned like liquid fire as Doc Whitman poured it over his surgical tools, preparing for the delicate work of removing 3 barbed arrowheads from Jacob's body, while the wounded man gritted his teeth against pain that would have broken lesser spirits. The small cabin had been transformed into a frontier operating room, with clean sheets draped over every surface and Victoria assisting despite her own broken arm, her hands steady as she held instruments and monitored Jacob's breathing throughout the grueling procedure that would determine whether he lived or died from his heroic sacrifice. The shoulder arrow missed the bone by maybe an inch, Doc Whitman muttered, his weathered hands working with the precision of 40 years' experience treating gunshot wounds, knife cuts, and arrow injuries on the unforgiving frontier. But this side wound, it's dangerously close to vital organs, and I can't tell how deep the point penetrated without going in after it. His honest assessment sent chills through everyone present, because they all understood that exploratory surgery in a cabin carried risks that could prove fatal. Jacob's face had gone the color of old parchment, but his eyes remained alert as he watched the doctor work. "Do what you have to do, Doc," he said through clenched teeth. "I've come this far. Not planning to quit now." His words carried the same quiet determination that had driven him across 200 yards of open prairie under enemy fire, though now the battle was being fought inside his own body against infection, shock, and blood loss. Victoria found herself marveling at Jacob's stoic endurance as Doc Whitman began the painstaking process of extracting the first arrowhead. She'd never witnessed such raw courage up close, not the flashy bravery of dime novel heroes, but the real thing, worn quietly by someone who simply refused to surrender despite overwhelming odds. Her own pain from the broken arm seemed trivial compared to what Jacob was enduring without complaint or self-pity. Marcus paced the cabin's small confines like a caged wolf, his earlier anger at Jacob replaced by something approaching reverence mixed with deep shame. The man he'd dismissed as worthless was displaying more character in one afternoon than Marcus had shown in years of privileged comfort. "There has to be something we can do," he said helplessly. "Some way to repay what he's done for us." "Keep talking to him," Doc Whitman advised without looking up from his delicate work. "Consciousness is good, it means his body's still fighting. And frankly, this man's will to live seems stronger than most folks' will to breathe." The doctor's words carried professional admiration for a patient whose determination was defying medical expectations about trauma and survival. Buck Harrison had stationed himself by the window, watching for any signs of Two Bears warriors returning for a second attempt at the cattle. But the hills remained empty except for circling hawks, and the old foreman began to suspect that the war party had withdrawn permanently, perhaps recognizing that such determined resistance suggested this particular target wasn't worth the cost in blood and ammunition. "Tell me about Mary," Victoria said softly, hoping to keep Jacob focused on pleasant memories while the doctor worked on removing the second arrow. "What was she like?" Her request was partially medical, keeping him talking, but also personal curiosity about the woman who'd inspired such devotion that her memory still guided Jacob's actions 3 years after her death. Jacob's smile transformed his pain-creased features as he spoke about his late wife, describing her laugh that could brighten the darkest winter day and her stubborn belief that any piece of land could bloom if you just worked it hard enough and loved it long enough. "She used to say that God put us here to take care of each other," he whispered. "That wealth meant nothing if you didn't use it to help folks who needed helping." The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Jacob had lived Mary's philosophy better than most rich folks lived theirs, giving freely to others despite having almost nothing to give. His poverty had never stopped him from sharing what little he possessed, whether it was medical help for an injured stranger or his life's blood spilled to protect other people's cattle from raiders seeking to feed their own families. "Second arrow's out," Doc Whitman announced, holding up the barbed iron point that gleamed wetly in the lamplight. "Clean extraction, No major blood vessels damaged. But this third one. He studied the shaft protruding from Jacob's side with obvious concern. It's the deepest and positioned where I can't see what it might have hid inside. This is where things get dangerous. Victoria squeezed Jacob's hand as the doctor prepared for the most critical part of the surgery, feeling his fingers tighten around hers with surprising strength despite his weakened condition. She'd known him for less than 2 days, but those days had contained more genuine human connection than she'd experienced in years of social gatherings, where conversation never went deeper than weather and gossip about absent neighbors. Whatever happens, Jacob said quietly, his eyes meeting Victoria's with startling intensity. Promise me you won't let this change who you are. You've got kindness in you that money can't buy and society can't teach. Don't let anyone convince you to hide that light under a bushel just because it makes them uncomfortable. His words carried the weight of someone who might be speaking his final wisdom. Marcus stepped closer to the makeshift operating table, his throat tight with emotions he rarely allowed himself to feel. Jacob, when you're healed up, I want to talk business with you. Real business, about partnership and profit sharing and making sure good men get rewarded for good work. His offer surprised everyone, including himself, but felt more right than anything he'd said in years. Let's get him healed first, Doc Whitman said pragmatically, beginning the delicate work on the final arrow. Though I'll say this, I've been practicing medicine on this frontier for 4 decades, and I've never seen anyone display this much grit while getting carved up like a Christmas goose. This man's got something special inside him, something that don't show up in bank accounts or land deeds. As afternoon lights slanted through the cabin windows, painting everything in golden hues that softened the harsh realities of frontier surgery, everyone present understood they were witnessing more than just medical treatment. They were watching the physical healing of a hero whose example had already begun healing the social wounds that divided rich from poor, worthy from worthless, in a territory where worth was usually measured by acres owned rather than courage displayed. The third arrow came free with a wet sound that made Victoria wince, but Jacob's breathing remained steady and his color began improving almost immediately. Doc Whitman cleaned and bandaged the wounds with professional efficiency, his movements speaking to years of experience patching up frontier folks who couldn't afford to stay broken for long in a land that demanded constant strength and resilience from everyone who called it home. Snow began falling like scattered prayers against the cabin windows as November settled over the Nebraska territory, and Jacob Mills woke each morning to find his small home transformed by gifts from people whose names he barely knew but whose gratitude ran deeper than the winter streams that carved channels through the frozen prairie. Sacks of flour appeared on his doorstep beside jars of preserved peaches. Warm quilts materialized to replace his thin blankets, and firewood mysteriously stacked itself against his cabin walls while he slept, as if the entire territory had conspired to ensure their hero would survive the coming winter in comfort he'd never known. Victoria arrived each morning with fresh bandages and hot meals prepared in the Ashford kitchen, her broken arm now healing cleanly, while she tended Jacob's wounds with the gentle competence of someone discovering hidden talents for healing and caregiving. Their conversations had evolved from polite gratitude into something deeper, genuine friendship built on mutual respect rather than social obligation, with Victoria finding herself sharing thoughts and dreams she'd never spoken aloud to anyone in her privileged but lonely world. The whole territory's talking about you, she reported one snowy morning while changing Jacob's bandages with practiced efficiency. They're calling you Arrow Jack in the saloons. And Buck says 3 different newspapers want to write stories about the man who held off 20 Bears' entire war party single-handed. Her voice carried amusement at Jacob's obvious discomfort with fame, but also pride in his accomplishments. Jacob shifted restlessly in his bed, embarrassed by attention he'd never sought and didn't feel he deserved. I just did what needed doing, he protested weakly. Any man worth his salt would have done the same thing in my place. But even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't entirely true. Courage like his was rare enough to deserve recognition, even if accepting praise felt uncomfortable for someone raised to expect disappointment rather than celebration. Marcus entered the cabin carrying a leather portfolio that contained documents which would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier, when Jacob Mills was known throughout the territory as its most spectacular failure. Now those same papers represented a future that could transform not just Jacob's circumstances but his entire understanding of what his life might become with the right opportunities and partners who valued character over capital. Partnership papers, Marcus explained, spreading the documents across Jacob's small table with the careful attention of someone presenting treasures rather than mere business contracts. Equal shares in a new venture, the Mills Ashford Cattle Company. Your knowledge of this land, your understanding of what it takes to survive here, combined with our resources and market connections. It's not charity, Jacob. It's smart business between partners who respect each other. Jacob studied the papers with amazement that grew into something approaching disbelief, because the terms were far more generous than anything he could have imagined. Equal partnership meant equal profits, equal decision-making authority, and equal respect in a business relationship that would transform him from debtor to stakeholder overnight. Marcus, I can't accept this, he said finally. My debts alone would sink any partnership before it started. Your debts have been cleared, Marcus replied matter-of-factly, producing receipts from the bank that showed Jacob's obligations had been paid in full. Consider it payment for services rendered, though honestly, no amount of money could repay what you did for our family and everyone who depends on the ranch for their livelihood. This partnership is about the future, not the past. Victoria watched the exchange with growing excitement as she saw Jacob beginning to understand that his life was about to change in ways that had nothing to do with charity and everything to do with earned respect. The man who'd been written off as worthless was discovering that true worth had been inside him all along, waiting for the right circumstances to reveal itself through actions rather than achievements. There's something else, Victoria added, her voice carrying a note of nervous anticipation that made both men look at her with curiosity. I've been thinking about what you said, about taking care of each other and using whatever wealth we have to help folks who need helping. I want to start a school here, a real school that teaches children regardless of whether their families can afford tuition. Jacob's eyes widened as he processed the implications of Victoria's proposal, understanding that she'd been listening not just to his words but to the philosophy behind them. Mary would have loved this idea. He realized education as a tool for lifting people up rather than keeping them in their assigned places. Mary always said that learning was the one thing nobody could take away from you once you had it, he said softly. Then we'll name it the Mary Mills School, Victoria declared impulsively, her decision surprising even herself with its rightness. A place where children learn that worth isn't inherited but earned, where character matters more than circumstances, and where every student understands that helping others is the highest form of success. Her words painted a vision of the future that honored the past while building something new and better. Buck Harrison chose that moment to arrive with news that completed the transformation of Jacob's circumstances, carrying word that the territorial governor himself wanted to meet the man whose courage had prevented a range war that could have cost dozens of lives on both sides. Seems your stand at those rocks impressed more than just local folks, Buck explained. Word spreading that we've got ourselves a genuine hero right here in the territory. But Jacob was looking out the window at the falling snow, thinking about Mary and the dreams they'd shared for making their corner of the world a little better for everyone who lived there. The partnership papers represented security he'd never imagined. The school would fulfill Mary's belief in education's power to transform lives, and the recognition meant that his story might inspire others to find their own courage when circumstances demanded it. I accept, Jacob said simply, his words carrying the weight of someone stepping into a future that honored both his sacrifice and his potential. But I want one condition added to those papers. A percentage of profits goes to helping families who are struggling the way I was struggling. Mary always said that folks who've been hungry understand hunger better than folks who've always been fed. As snow continued falling outside, blanketing the Nebraska territory in pristine white that covered old scars and promised new beginnings, 3 people sat around a simple table and signed documents that would change not just their own lives but the lives of everyone touched by their example. Jacob Mills had learned that being shot full of arrows while saving someone else's cattle wasn't just an act of heroism. It was a declaration that his worth had never been determined by society's ledger books, but by the courage he'd carried in his heart all along. The reward had indeed been worth every scar, not because it brought material wealth, but because it had revealed the immeasurable value of authentic human character in a world too often governed by artificial divisions of status and circumstance. And sometimes, The greatest riches come disguised as the most desperate gambles, proving that true partnerships are forged not in boardrooms but in moments when character matters more than capital, when courage speaks louder than cash, and when the poorest man in the territory discovers he's been wealthy all along.